Good morning. Welcome back to our study in the Gospel of John. We're calling John That You May Believe. Today is our last session in John, but we'll move on. We'll talk about where we're going to go after this at the end of our session today. Today is February 7th, and in 2021, it's about 20 below zero and 6 feet of snow outside. But on this date in 1613, Michael Romanov became the first Romanov Tsar of Russia. Started the Romanov family, and as you may recall, the Romanovs lasted up until the early part of the 20th century when they were all killed off by the new communist regime. Or were they all killed off? I don't know. Who knows? It was on this date in 1672 that Solomon Stoddard assumed the pastorate of the Northampton Church in Massachusetts. Solomon Stoddard was a fairly well-known person. His big contribution at that time is what was called the Halfway Covenant, an interesting moment in American church history. My personal opinion is if the American evangelical Protestant church was the dominant religion in America, it ended with the Halfway Covenant, but that's just not my opinion. Also known for being the grandfather of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, the famous preacher from the early part of the 18th century, who is known for being the grandfather of Aaron Burr, for those of you who watched Hamilton, the guy who killed Alexander Hamilton. So Solomon Stoddard would be his great-great-great-grandfather, I believe. On this date in 1839, Henry Clay said in the United States Senate that he would rather be right than president, his famous statement. And two things are true, have since become true. One, Henry Clay has never became president. And secondly, I don't think any other president has ever said that since 1839, or any other presidential candidate has said that since 1839. Regardless, on this date in 1945, Douglas MacArthur returns to Manila. He returned to Manila in the Philippines. He had landed there in the Leyte Gulf about 3 or 4 months prior, October 20th. And it was just a year ago that Debbie and I were in Manila, and we were at the Leyte Gulf. I think I'm going to try and stick a picture right here of that's us on the Leyte Gulf. But it was on this date in 1945. Interestingly, many people don't know this, but Douglas MacArthur's father, Arthur MacArthur, had been like the military governor of the Philippines for quite some time. So when MacArthur, one of the reasons why MacArthur took such a personal interest in the Philippines during World War II and afterwards was because his father had spent a great deal of time, and he had spent a great deal of time there as a youngster. Today is John Deere's birthday. He was born on this date in 1804. I believe the story goes his clothes, they wrapped him with this odd shape of green. I don't know, but John Deere was born on this date in 1804. A couple of writers on this date in 1812. Charles Dickens was born. Charles Dickens, who wrote Hard Times, Tale of Two Cities, Christmas Carol, all kinds of other stories. Great author. And we've been to his favorite pub in England. Can't remember the name, the Colonial George Inn, I think. I could be wrong there. But that was, the Chester Cheese Shop. But we've been there. It's in England. You can go there and you'll see the chair where Charles Dickens used to sit. But that's in England. He was born on this date in 1812. In 1885, Sinclair Lewis was born. Sinclair Lewis lived in California, wrote several books, including The Jungle, which is a very interesting book. He also ran an interesting campaign for California governor. If you are interested in politics and electioneering and the use of public opinion polls and advertising, look up the Sinclair Lewis gubernatorial campaign in California. And finally, on this date, in 1917, Milton Milt Holland was born. Born on this date in 1917, Milton Milt Holland, who was a drummer, a percussionist, and an ethnomusicologist. And I know many of you are thinking to myself, who on earth is Milt Holland? Well, I'm betting many of you have heard his work. If you have ever seen the show Bewitched, you know the show I'm talking about, Bewitched. And when Samantha rubs her nose, or she wrinkles her nose, there's a sound. That's Milt Holland did that sound. So that he was born on this date in 1917. So with that, let's get back into talking about the Gospel of John and the epilogue and the great catch of fish and Peter's restoration. Welcome back to our last session on John, the Gospel of John. Today we're going to be talking about John chapter 21, the epilogue as we've been calling it. If you remember last week we talked about John 20 where the resurrection appearances of Jesus. And as you recall, what happened was that Mary comes to the tomb, Mary Magdalene and others, we know from the synoptics. Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb, sees the stone rolled away, may have looked in, may have not, runs to the disciples. She meets up with Peter and John. Peter and John then run to the tomb. Ultimately, both go in. They see that the body is gone, and then they leave and go back to their house. Mary comes back. Mary sees two angels. Woman, why are you crying? Then turned around and she sees Jesus, although she doesn't realize it's Jesus at the time. And then goes back and tells the disciples that he's seen the Lord. And then the Lord appears to the disciples in the locked room, but Thomas isn't there. And then he appears to them a second time, this time when Thomas is there. I did want to make one correction of something I said last week. In John chapter 20, when I was talking about verses 8 and 9, said that John looked in the tomb and believed in verse 8. And then in verse 9, John the writer says, they still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. And I pointed out that there were a couple of passages that referenced that make, because there's no specific quotation given here. So we're left to speculate what it is. Or not necessarily speculate, but at the time. And then I said there was no New Testament passage that referenced any verse. I talked about Psalm 16 in particular. And that was wrong. That is incorrect. In fact, there's actually two pretty strong indications in the New Testament. Peter in Acts chapter 2, in his great sermon at Pentecost, refers to that verse in Psalm where you won't let me see decay, as referring to Jesus. Actually, what he says is that Jesus rising from the dead, just like God promised, he would not let the body see decay. And then the Apostle Paul brought it up again in Acts chapter 13 in one of his sermons, and I think it was at Antioch Pisidia. I had it written down somewhere, and I don't have it now. But so twice there are two New Testament references where both Peter and Paul refer to that particular passage as being something that foreshadows Jesus' resurrection. Okay, and then we ended chapter 20 with the talk about those who have not seen and yet believed, and that Jesus performed many other signs in the presence, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And we said that in many ways certainly ends the book of glory. And some look at this and say it ends the major story of the Gospel of John. And yet we have this epilogue. We have this last chapter. And in this chapter, there's another post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to his disciples, to at least 7 of his disciples. And there's an interaction between Jesus and Peter, and a little bit with all the disciples, with the 7 disciples, and with Peter, and then to a lesser extent with John. And so you have this chapter 21, this epilogue that happens after the fact. And I've mentioned earlier that there's a great parlor game in theological circles to look at the Gospel of John as a collection of pieces and try to rearrange them and move them. And there are some who have suggested that chapter 21 was added, that the original writer, John, stopped at verse 20, chapter 20, and that was it. And then somebody later, perhaps after John's death, added on chapter 21, or the passage that we now call chapter 21. Side note, chapters and verses, not part of the original text. They came in the 12th and 15th century, I believe. So what we call John chapter 21, that passage, that pericope, that story, that was put in later, okay? And there's a couple of reasons why people believe this, or why this is often talked about, okay? The first one is that because John 20, verse 31 just ends so nicely, that, I've written these things that you may believe, that this purpose statement, it's just such a nice ending to the book of signs. And it's just such a nice ending. And then to have this extra bit is just sort of like, ooh, wait, there's more kind of thing. Maybe some of you have watched a film or read a book where it ends and this is a great ending. And then there's more. Or perhaps you've watched a movie where you think, wow, the movie should have ended here, but they kept going and just made it worse. And so some have looked at it and said, it just ended so nicely there. But it goes on. That's one particular argument. Another argument is because it's in a different locale. They say, Jesus, now suddenly they're in Galilee. Okay, and I'll talk about that a little bit when we get down to the actual text. But they say, because it's a different locale. And similar to that, a third reason is because there's a slightly different vocabulary. In fact, in chapter 21, there are 28 words in chapter 21 that are not used anywhere else in the Gospel of John. And so some have looked at that and said, this is because somebody else wrote it. Okay, and that may be true. That makes sense. Let me put it that way. That makes sense, except for the fact that in John chapter 21, you have, for one thing, you have a new topic, fishing, okay, which is where the bulk of these different words are. So Jesus, up until here, has not really had to talk about fishing or the mechanics of fishing or that kind of thing. And so that kind of explains why there's a new vocabulary. And really, if you think about it, these are kind of grasping at things. I know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff, and I'm just trying to think of something, a topic, that if I suddenly decided to start talking about how to fix refrigerators and started using a lot of words like condenser and compressor and temperature and things like that. Now, these are words that I haven't used in the first 19 or 18 or however many of these sessions we've done. You wouldn't say it's a different person. It's a different topic. Okay, so who's to say you can't do that? And the fact that he moved in to a different locale. He goes back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem within the text as well. So these really aren't good reasons. Reasons why it should be included, why it should just left the way it is first of all, is because that's the way it is. It's been that way, and it does serve a purpose. It has a message of reconciliation, and I don't think it does any harm. And a second thing is that there's no record of the text ever being produced, I'll call it that, written out, copied, without John chapter 21. Now compare this to Mark chapter 16. Mark is the second gospel, and those of us who studied it, that there's what is referred to as the longer ending of Mark. And that is Mark 16 has 8 verses, or it has 28 verses. I forget how many are in the longer ending. And there are a significant number of manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark that don't include the longer ending. And so it's very clear from the manuscript evidence that at some point this longer ending of Mark wasn't included. Whereas with John 21 has always been there. Okay, so to me, it's there. It's a part of the book. We're going to study it. Okay, so let's go on to looking at John chapter 21, beginning with verse 1. Afterward, Jesus again appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so now we changed locales. Okay, previously they were in Jerusalem. Now they're in Galilee. And we know that later on they're going to go back to Jerusalem because that's where Pentecost takes place. But regardless, that's getting beyond our story. So they're up in the Sea of Galilee, okay? And that's about 75 miles or so north of Jerusalem. So it's a several days walk for them to get up there. And there are at least 7 disciples here in this particular group, okay? Now we know from one of the synoptics that Jesus had said, told them that I'm going, or told Mary, one of the women, that I'm going to go to Galilee, I'm going to meet them in Nazareth or something like that. So we have an understanding that they're going to there, they're going up there and they're waiting for Jesus, they're waiting for their next step. Okay, and it says, it happened this way. Okay, now we're going to list out the disciples that are there. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus. Okay, remember we had Thomas known as Didymus. This is doubting Thomas, so to speak. Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, this James and John, and 2 other disciples were together. So that's 7. So there's 7 disciples there. We don't know who the 2 other disciples are. The sons of Zebedee are James and John. John, the apostle. John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. John, the author of the gospel that we're reading. Okay, so these 7 disciples are there, and they're waiting. They're waiting for Jesus. Okay. Verse 3, I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Okay. Now, a lot of it has been made about this decision. Is this backsliding? Are they, you got to figure Peter and James and John are fishermen by trade. This is what they know how to do. And if they're back at the Sea of Galilee, they're back at their house, they're sitting there by the boat, they need to wait, they're waiting. Well, why not do something you're good at? And they still need to eat. Okay, so maybe they just need some food. Maybe they need some, maybe they're hungry. So something to do, something profitable, they're going to go, let's go fishing. So they go. So now apparently all 7 of them are out in at least one boat. Okay, there might have been 2, because 7 of them in these boat would have been rather crowded, but there's 7 of them out in this boat. Let's just assume 7 in one boat. Okay, could be more boats. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. Now, we know from later in the text that they're about 100 yards out. Okay, so about the length of a football field. Okay, I understand there's something to do with football happening today. Don't know, not a big fan, but some of you will know what I'm talking about. But so they're about that far away from the shore. Okay, we know that from later in the text, and Jesus appears there. Okay, but they don't know it's Jesus. Now, keep in mind, it's early in the morning. It may not be fully light yet. They're not expecting to see Jesus on the shore. Now, they are expecting to see Jesus at some point, but not at that point, not then, and not there. Okay, so I think the reason they don't recognize him is because, again, same reasons as Mary, that Mary didn't recognize him. They're not expecting to see him there. Maybe he's not wearing what they expect here. So Jesus calls out to them. He called out to them, verse 5, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. Okay, so this is pretty, Now, again, to a certain extent, they're out of practice. Okay, they haven't fished for a while, so maybe that's part of it. So they're out of fish. No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. Now this is kind of odd. These guys would have these nets that were weighted on the end, and they would throw them out and they would settle down, and then they would scoop them up and they would be fishing them. In fact, my wife and I just watched a video the other day, a documentary about Myanmar, and formerly known as Burma, and in this they had a picture of people that were casting nets out of their boats, fishing just in this very same way. So people to this day still fish this way. So for whatever reason, okay, and we don't really know, we can speculate, but for whatever reason, after being out a long time fishing, out all night, not catching anything. They see somebody on the shore, so cast nets on the other side, and they do it. Okay? Maybe it's they know that if they don't and they go back into the shore, the guy, whoever he may be, they don't recognize him yet, is going to say, well, why didn't you do what I told you? Okay? But regardless, they cast their nets on the other side, and what happens? When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Okay? So they throw the net overboard. And again, it'd be circular with weights on it. They would throw the net overboard. The net would settle. It would collect up fish, and it was too big for them. Typically, they would pick it up and bring it into the boat. Okay, but at this point, it was too big to do that. There were too many fish in it, so they kind of tied it to the boat and figured they would drag it in with the boat. Okay, just basic fishing, first century fishing concepts here. Okay. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Now, how is it that John, the disciple whom Jesus loves, recognizes this? Well, one of two things, or a combination of both. One, the voice. Maybe he'd heard him enough. He realizes that's the voice of Jesus. Secondly, the miraculous fish. They went from nothing to a large number of fish. Okay? Something in the combination of the two, maybe the light just blinked a little bit or the clouds broke and he got a look. Somehow or other, John realizes it's the Lord. Okay, it's Jesus, and he says so. Peter, as soon as Simon Peter heard him say it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. Okay, now there's a lot of discussion on just what Peter is doing. So again, they're on in the boat. Peter is probably down to like a loincloth so that things don't get wet. But he's got his clothes with him. He puts his clothes on to jump into the water. Yes, okay, that's what the text says. Does it make sense to us in the 21st century? Probably not. But then again, we're not there. So he didn't know how long they were going to be out there, and he wanted to get back, and he needed his clothes. So what better way to get them than to wear them? So, and plus they're not that far, 100 yards. Most people, if you know how to swim, you can make it 100 yards. It'll be tough. Believe me, I've been there where I've gone a long time without any kind of physical activity and then tried to swim 100 yards. It was not a pretty scene, but it can be done. And so that's what Peter does. He jumps in the water and off he goes. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish. Now I'm sure that they're, if I were them, I'd be a little annoyed. Peter, hey, we got this huge net, and you jump off the boat and leave us to carry the rest of the fish in. But that's just me. For they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. Okay, here's the idea. So here's where we get the distance. So this boat comes in towing this thing of fish. Okay. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Okay, fish and bread. Again, interesting. Remember the feeding of the 5,000 in John 5, I think it was. Fish and bread. Is that repeating something? Perhaps. But fish and bread on it. But fish and bread was also fairly common food. So there you go. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbs back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Now, this is interesting on a couple of reasons. First of all, Jesus here, once again, is just taking care of business. Now, typically what you would do is you would bring the fish into the boat, and then you would take the fish to wherever. Now, they did have within these fishing communities, sometimes they would have little like areas. Maybe they were stoned, cement, it's cement now, just rocks, where they would have these little ponds created where they could put the fish so they would stay alive. Sort of like how when you go fishing, some of you have the little buckets that when you catch a fish, you put it in the bucket and it swims around in there until you're ready to go. So, but you didn't want to just leave them in the net. Okay, so Jesus just basically saying, take care of business here. Okay, so take care of the fish, bring them in so where you can do something with them, and then we can move on. Okay. Now what's interesting is that we have a number of fish. So apparently, in the act of bringing them in, either Peter or one of the disciples decided, hey, wouldn't it be fun to count the fish? Whether they normally counted fish or not, I don't know. I would guess usually it was just sort of based on a size. But in this situation, they decided to count the fish. And they count them. And there are 153 of them. Okay. Now, there's been all kinds of fun about this very specific number. Okay, this very specific number, why are they so specific about there being 153 fish? And there's been a couple of ideas. Okay, Jerome, who was around in the 2nd century, I believe, posited the idea that there were 153 fish because, according to another Greek scientist at the time, there were 153 types of fish. Okay, and so 153, so your bass, your bluegill, all the other kind of fish that there may have existed at the time. Okay, there were 153, and so the 153 represents every type of fish. That represents Jesus. Remember Jesus earlier in one of the earlier synoptics, I'll make you fishers of men. And so this is kind of talking about the success that the church is going to be able to bring in all types. Okay, interesting. Problem is, it's long been determined there are far more than 153 types of fish. So the whole basis of it is incorrect. Okay, another idea has to do with the number itself, 153. So 153 is what's called, as I understand it, a triangular number. Now, I was a history major, not a math major, but as I understand it, a triangular number, and if I'm wrong, I apologize in the actual name. But what happens is it's a number that's the sum of all the numbers before. So if you add 1 plus 2, so 3 is a triangular of 1 plus 2, and then 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. And if you add up the numbers 1 through 17, you get 153. Okay, and so it's a triangular of 17. And then some have looked at the number 17 and said, wow, that means that, there were 10 commandments and 7 days in the week. Makes 17. Okay, so I think you're really, really stretching. But if you're really crazy about numbers and numerology and you like that kind of thing, well, here you go. You're going to spend some time here. I think the more likely thing is, one, for whatever odd reason, they decided to count the fish. This is a very large number of fish. And this is just proof of what a large number of fish it is. Maybe a normal catch was 50 fish. And they want to talk about the day, well, yeah, you remember the day when we caught 153 fish? Okay, so it's just a way of documenting a very large, obviously miraculous catch of fish. Okay, that's really all it is here. Okay, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Now, looking at this, is there a lesson? Is there a spiritual lesson here? Okay, for the church or for your own thing, for your own life. Okay, cast your net on the other side. There's a kids song. Fished all night, caught no fish, something, and cast your net on the other side. And maybe some of you were in Vacation Bible School and you learned to sing this song. You're fishing all night and then cast your, there's motions and all that kind of stuff, all that great VBS stuff. Is there a lesson here? Cast your net on the other side. Well, perhaps. Give it one more try. Cast your net on the other side. Give it one more try, and then again, I think you're going beyond the text here. I think this is just John is telling the story that's going to lead up to the real reason for the passage is the interaction with Peter. Okay, and these are the details of what happened. Okay, so again, it's an interesting story. I don't think we really want to go too far into it. We don't want to do what's called spiritualizing the text, where you look at details in a narrative and you say, well, this happened this way. This must mean this for me in my life in 2021. Okay, you can really go off the rails here on stuff like this. So what we know is this is a miraculous catch. It's a huge catch, and it's going to keep these guys eating for quite a while. Okay, for a number of reasons. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now again, Jesus is already fishing here, or I'm sorry, Jesus is already cooking fish, and he says, come and have breakfast. So he feeds them. Okay, again, like the feeding of the 5,000. One of the big questions is, why does Jesus feed the 5,000? Well, mainly because they were hungry. Now, these guys have been out all night, and what are you thinking of? You're out working all night, you come in, the first thing, what are you going to want to do? You're going to want to eat. Okay, here they are. Jesus said, come and have breakfast. Interesting here in at the end of verse 12, none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Okay. Now, again, so what this is telling us is that this is an awkward scene. Okay. Maybe they're awkward because they just kind of don't know how. And really, there aren't a lot of protocols on how to deal with a resurrected Messiah. Okay. So there are no rule books. They can't Google a YouTube video. Google YouTube. You can't YouTube a video to see how to do it. So they're sort of like, okay, what do we do now? What do we, what's next? Nobody wants to be the one to ask the question. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Okay, so the first time would be in the locked room. The second time would be a week later when he met Thomas. And now here, this is the third time John is talking about. Okay, so now we're going to get into verse 15. And this is really why we're into chapter 21. This is why the epilogue is here. It's because we need to get Peter back in place. And that's what's going to happen here. Beginning with verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Okay, there's a logistics question here. Okay, and by logistics, it's like where they were. So there's two ways to read this story in terms of what's physical happening. Okay, it could be that Jesus and Peter get up and start walking. Okay, right away. And they're walking and talking as they do this. I think the better idea is that this conversation is going on. Jesus is asking Peter in front of the other 6 disciples. Okay, and then at some point, they get up and start walking. And I will revisit that in a second when we get down to later in the passage. Okay, but I think this conversation takes place in front of these other 6 disciples. Remember, there were 7, and Peter is one of them, so there are 6 others, this many, sitting there. Okay? So now Jesus is asking Peter. He's just ate. He's sitting there looking at Jesus, and Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these? More than what? Okay? Well, more than these. There's basically 3 ideas as far as what the 3 could be. Do you love me more than you love these other 6 guys? Okay. Peter, do you love me more than you love these 6 guys? That's one idea. Or a second thing is Peter had gone out fishing and had taken these 6 with him, and maybe he's looking at his fishing accoutrements and he says, Peter, do you love me more than your lifestyle? Do you love me more than your job? Okay, maybe that's the question. Maybe that's what he's asking. Or third, and this is probably the most likely, and this is what most of the commentators believe, is that, Peter, do you love me more than these 6 love me? Okay, now, go back to Peter's backstory here. Remember when Jesus said that you're all going to fall away? What did Peter say? No. If everyone else falls away, I'm not going to fall away. Okay, so in that statement, Peter is implying, hey, listen, I love you more. I am more loyal to you than any of these other guys are, because they're going to fall away, like you said, but I'm going to stick with you. Which, does he? No, he doesn't. Okay, so it's a legitimate question, because it's an implication that Peter had given earlier. So Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these guys love me? Do you? Do you really? I'm just kind of following up what you said earlier. Do you love me more than these guys love me? Peter says, yes, Lord. He said, you know that I love you. Jesus replied, feed my lambs. Okay. go back to the backstory of what Jesus has talked about. Remember John chapter 10, I am the good shepherd, and my sheep hear my voice, and all that. And so he's given a command here. He says, feed my lambs. Okay? That's the shepherd's job. Make sure the lambs get fed. That's the shepherd's job. He's take over my work here. Okay? Now, that's a great give and take, fun little, thing. But then what does Jesus say? He asks Peter again. He says, Peter, again Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. So it's the same question. Do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Again, do the work of the shepherd. Take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Okay, do the work of the shepherd. Because, he knows there's an implication he's not going to be there in a while. Okay, now, this is usually referred to as the restoration of Peter. And if you've been around the church at any length of time, you've heard sermons based on this. And very often it goes in a direction like this. And it has to do with the Greek words for love. And there are two ones that we're talking about here, phileo and agape. Phileo, and it's usually the comparison is usually done something like phileo is sort of a fondness, is a brotherly love kind of thing, and agape is that deep sort of love. Phileo is where we get love of things, philosophy, love of wisdom. Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, that where we get that from. Okay, and so because these words get interchanged, and I'm not going to go into all of the different details where they get interchanged through this, where Jesus says, do you agape me? Peter says, yes, I phileo you, kind of thing. And so people have looked at that and said, oh, okay, so there's three different questions being asked here because of the different uses of the verbs and the answers and all of that kind of stuff, okay? And a lot of mileage has been gotten out of that. See, here's the problem with that. The word phileo, and I've been casually mentioning it as we go along when the word love comes up, that the word phileo and the word agape in the New Testament and in John are used interchangeably. Okay, there isn't that big difference. Okay, and so this isn't a mounting challenge to Peter. Okay, do you like me, Peter? Do you love me, Peter? Do you really, really love me, Peter? That's kind of the way it's, and Peter is unable to say, I really, really love you. Peter keeps saying, oh yeah, I really like you, kind of thing. It's and it becomes this odd sort of what we would look at as in like a rom-com, some silly commitment question, and it isn't that. It's just Peter is asked 3 times. Why do you suppose Peter is asked this 3 times? Why does Jesus respond? Why does Jesus ask this question 3 times? Well, a really good idea, a really good reason for that is because Peter denied him 3 times. Okay? So Peter had said, listen, I'm going to stick with you when everyone else falls away, and then, do you know this guy? No. Do you know this guy? No. Do you know this guy? No. So now, a couple weeks later, Jesus is going, do you love me, Peter? Yeah. Okay, well, that takes care of the first one. Do you love me, Peter? Do you love me, Peter? Okay. So basically, this is just Peter's restoration. This is Peter realizing, look, I love you. I love you, Lord. I love you, and Peter is given his tasks. So despite what he's done, despite this betrayal of the Lord, Peter is restored, and he's given this job. He's given this responsibility. Do the work of a shepherd. Okay? Feed the sheep. Take care of the sheep. Protect the sheep. Okay? He's given this work of the shepherd to do. This is Peter's restoration. And I think the real lesson here is not necessarily Peter's growth, but that is 2 possible directions you could go here. Number 1 is that for us to be fully productive within our own Christian life, that we need to address the failures. We need to go back and say, okay, listen, I failed that time. But forgiveness exists, and restoration exists. And Jesus here is restoring Peter. And if Jesus can restore Peter, he can restore you, he can restore me, he can restore any of us. Think about what Peter did. Peter said he was going to do something and then immediately backed out of it. And what he said he was going to do was to stand beside the Messiah. Okay? This isn't just forgetting somebody's birthday. Okay? This is a major oversight. Okay? And yet he can be restored. Jesus says to him, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and somebody will lead you where you don't want to go. And somebody else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Okay, what is he talking about? Well, we know what he's talking about because Jesus said this in verse 19 to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Interesting here. Again, remember, as the second half of this book of John is called the Book of Glory, and it's all about Jesus' death. And so death and glorification are tied together in John. That something about Jesus dying is going to glorify him. And here he's telling Peter, listen, this is what's going to happen to you. And this idea that you're going to stretch out your hand, okay, that kind of has a connotation, many believe, similar to crucifixion. In fact, if you were to look at somebody, you see two people standing, not right next to you, but away, and you see one person suddenly do this, put their hands out like this, okay? This motion here, the only reason, or a very good reason why somebody would put their hands out like this is because they're getting handcuffs put on them, okay? And so this is kind of that same idea. Someday you're going to stretch your hands out and somebody's going to lead you where you do not want to go. Now, the original readers, most people believe that when this was written, Peter's death had already occurred, okay? And so the original readers would go, oh yeah, Peter's hands were stretched out. So Peter is you remember when earlier in the gospel, or I don't remember if it's John or in Mark, where Peter says, they said about the cup, can you take the cup? This is James and John actually, but Peter is told, Peter is told by Jesus, listen, you're going to follow me quite literally. And tradition has it that that Peter was crucified. Actually, some tradition has it that Peter was crucified upside down. Again, it's tradition. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Okay, but regardless. So he says, then he said, so Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Okay, now go back to our logistics question. Now it could be at this point. Now they're at the campfire. There's 7 of them and Jesus. So there's 8 people. It could be that all of this, Peter, do you love me, is taking place at the campfire, and then Jesus says, Peter, follow me. And they get up and start walking at that point. Now, I think that's what they're talking about. Okay? I think that's what's happening here. Now, you can disagree with me if you want. It's not a huge thing. But I think at this point, maybe Jesus wants to say something else to Peter. Okay? Maybe he wants to have a little private conversation with him. So he says, follow me. Okay? Now, you could look at this and say, no, this is a lifetime challenge. Follow me. Okay? I don't think so, although you can take it that way if you want because of what comes later. But because now at this point, they're apparently moving. So by this point in the text, they're moving, whereas earlier they were sitting. Okay, so now at this point, they're moving because Peter turned in verse 20. He said to follow me. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved, that is, John, was following them. So now Jesus and Peter are walking, and Peter turns and he sees John. And Peter says to Jesus, what about him? Okay. Jesus had just told Peter what kind of a death he is going to pursue, or a kind of an inclination of what his death is going to be. And Peter says, well, what about John? What about him? What kind of death is he going to pursue? And Jesus says, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Okay? Basically, he says to Peter, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Okay? What I'm going to do with him is up to me. You worry about you. This is me, as the kids say, Peter, you do you, and what you need to do is follow me. And this is where I think Jesus is giving him you must follow me. And that's where Jesus is giving him the life challenge to follow me. But because of what he says here, verse 23, because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? Okay, this is an odd little thing, but again, remember the original readers. Okay, so the original readers, now there's one question about whether John, by the time John's gospel is put out, whether he is still alive or not. And so there are some that suggested that this is added. I don't think so, because I think what happened is tradition tells us that John is the last disciple to live, or to be alive. Okay, the last disciple to die, I should say. Okay, and so there's a great question and this happens with any popular group of people, that when the last one dies, something ends. And so I think there was this understanding that Jesus was going to return, and this is kind of getting into something completely different, but there was this understanding that Jesus was going to return before the disciples died out. And now John is approaching his death, and people are saying, well, wait a minute, John, and maybe they're getting crazy about end time stuff. It's a speculation, okay? And not that we've ever gotten crazy about end time stuff, but here John says, and John just kind of throws this in. That's Jesus is saying, I'm not going to die. Okay? Jesus did not promise that he would come back before all the disciples died. Okay? He's just kind of making this clear. And to throw in, he says, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. It's John. He says, John, basically, he's going out of the third person into the first person, because Jesus never said John wasn't going to die, and I'm John. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. We know that his testimony is true. Again, one of the arguments that this is added is because if John is the sole disciple, who's we? Okay? Well, it's the same we in John chapter 1 where it says we have seen his glory. Okay? So here we know that his testimony is true. Is John speaking in the editorial we, the royal we? Yes. That's certainly a very good way to describe it. And the last thing John writes, and I think this is just sort of a last thought, looking back, and he says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Some of you may know the song, could the scroll contain the whole, forget the name of the song now. I'm going to think about it later. But regardless, John is just pointing out, there were a lot of other things I could have written down, but there's not enough paper to write all of the things down. And with that, the Gospel of John ends. Okay, but I'm not quite done yet. I do have one more thing, I kind of want to talk a little bit about one other idea, or just kind of a summary of the book, and we'll do that, and I'll be back in just a second. All right, how do you summarize the Gospel of John? And how do you finish up studying it all these weeks? I hope you have learned something. I hope you've been blessed. And I thought, as kind of a final thought, we still have like the end of John in our mind, I wanted to go back to the prologue. And I just wanted to revisit the prologue real quick. Remember, we talked about the prologue, then the Book of Science, Book of Glory, and the epilogue. So today I'm going to go back to the prologue and look at some of the phrases and things and think how they were kind of developed as we went through the book of John. In the beginning, verse 1, chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Now again, we're talking about Jesus here. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Think back to Jesus' statement in this world you should have troubles, but have peace. I have overcome the world. Here, the darkness couldn't overcome it because he overcame it. Dropping down to verse 9, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. Remember what Jesus said, I am the light of the world? He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Remember that where he was talking about the Pharisees, I think in John 12, where he said that even though he did all these signs, they did not believe him. And the Pharisees would have been ones that you would think would have, that they would have recognized him. Yet to all, verse 11, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Remember John 10 where Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice and I know them. And then the Pharisees got all upset. What are you saying we're not? It's like, well, if you knew, you wouldn't be having this conversation. So he came into his own and his own received him not. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. These are his sheep. These are the sheep that Peter is told to feed my sheep. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John is testifying that, listen, I saw this is an eyewitness account. Out of his fullness, verse 16, out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. Moving on. So, and then he gets into all the stories about John the Baptist and all that kind of stuff, kind of thing. I'm just kind of thinking back of what were my favorite parts of John, or my favorite stories. I still like John 9 with the story of the man born blind, with the who sinned, him or his father, or him or his parents, neither, and this one happened and all that. And then the scene with the Pharisees where they ask his parents, they ask him, he's of age. I still enjoy that. But I was just specifically moved, with this time again, the passage in John 16 where he says, in this world you'll have troubles, but I have overcome the world. And John 20 where Jesus said, or John tells us that he picked these things so that believing you may believe on his name. And so, just a final thought, we talked about it, that passage in John chapter 20 can be taken a couple of different ways. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. I hope that if you are a believer and you're watching this, that you have been blessed. I hope that you've learned something. Even if in an attempt to prove I'm wrong, you learned something, that's good enough for me. I have learned an awful lot. And if you're not a believer, if you're still kind of wondering, again, look back on John chapter 1, where he says, to as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God, I should say. I would encourage you to do that. So next week we are going to continue talking about John, only we're going to talk about John a little bit later. We're going to talk about John and his epistles. So your assignment is to read the epistles of John. Okay, now there are 3 of them, but it's only 8 chapters, okay, at most. So it's not a lot of reading. So read them through, and with all books of the Bible, whenever you start to study a book of the Bible, just read it through. Just read the epistle through, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. Just read it through. Don't take notes. Don't get your highlighter out or anything like that. Don't sit there and try and parse every little phrase out or everything. Just get the idea of what is this book about? What is John saying? Because we're not going to spend a lot of time in this epistle, okay? We're going to kind of look at it as a continuation of John's message in the gospel, and how he fulfills or fills out some of the points there. So we're not going to spend a lot of time. We're not going to spend 8 weeks in the epistles. I'm thinking 2 weeks tops, and then we'll move into one of Paul's epistles just to be different. So any questions or anything, let me know. Give me a call, shoot me an email, leave a note on Facebook, leave a note on YouTube. Anyway, it's been my pleasure, and I look forward to being with you again next week. Thanks.